Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Michael Fraud. I'm the Assistant Program Director at Drisha, and I'm very happy to have everyone back here for our last session in our series, Quandaries of Quarantine, in Biblical, Talmudic, and Hasidic Literature with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. Rabbanit Sarna is our Associate Director of Education as well as the Director of High School Programs at Drisha. She was ordained by Yeshivat Maharat and has previously served as the Director of Religious Engagement at Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel Congregation in Chicago. This class has been focusing on the different forms that solitude takes in Jewish tradition, the positive portrayals, the negative portrayals, the ambiguous portrayals that we have of it. We have so far focused on different passages from Tanakh and from rabbinic literature in the Mishnah and the Talmud. We are going to be spending a bit of time today looking at some Hasidic sources from Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. So we're very excited to wrap up this series together and to keep thinking through the different ways in which the presentations of solitude that we see in our tradition can help inform our own experiences of solitude in retrospect and going forward as we navigate COVID and other personal situations that might cause us to grapple with some of those questions. We always appreciate it if people are able to keep their videos on so that we can look around, see the faces of the folks who are in the room with us. Of course, if for some reason that is not so feasible, we completely understand that people sometimes need to keep their videos off. We do ask that people also just be careful to keep themselves on mute when possible and to remute yourself after you chime in with a question so we can avoid any background noise or distractions. If you have questions, there will be Q&A sessions throughout. We can also make use of the chat or the comment section. If you're following us on Facebook Live, feel free to write your questions and comments in there. And if you're on Facebook Live, I'll make sure that those get relayed to Rabbanit Sarna. And I will be sharing a copy of the source sheet in the chat and on Facebook Live, although I believe we'll also be doing a screen share for most of the relevant portions of the session. If you have any tech questions, audio issues, things like that, please feel free to send me a direct message. But other than that, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbanit Sarna for our learning.
Hi, everyone. Great to see everyone back here for our last session. Let me put you on the gallery view so I can actually see people. Hello. Really great to see you. It's pouring here. My window is open, so if you start to hear the rain, just let me know and I'll close the window, but I'm actually enjoying the nice air that's coming in. So you'll just let me know if that's starting to bother you on your end. So as Michael very summarized very well, we started off talking about in our first session, we focused on these two main models of tzara'at, sometimes translated as leprosy, and miluim, the inauguration of the priests. And we talked about how quarantine can kind of take these many different feelings to it. So with leprosy, the leper poses the danger, and the reason why you're in quarantine is because you pose danger from other people. For the miluim, the danger is kind of outside. The danger is if you break the rules, if you do something that you're not exactly supposed to do. And for that, you're in quarantine to protect you from the dangers of the world. So those two kind of basic different impulses of where does danger lie in those two situations. And then in the second session, we looked at this kind of a third model that gets brought up also at the beginning of Yoma, which is the Sinai model. Oh, sorry. We also talked about the piece that comes out of Miluim, which is that the priest has to quarantine in advance of the red heifer ritual, and that we actually don't really see inside the Torah, but the Mishnah reads that in. Okay, and then in session number 2, we talked about this Sinai model that gets emulated by Elijah and then by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Happy Lag BaOmer, everyone. So glad we're here. And that model of of just like purity, and you have to run. You can't be around other people because they are not as they're not as zealous as you are if you're Elijah, or they don't hold your opinions about Rome, and they don't keep halacha well enough if you're Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai or his son Rabbi Elazar. And then last week we took a kind of Talmud only approach, but based on a verse from Eicha, which is Yoshev V'Dad Dom. He sits alone and is silent, and we saw different reads of that. So we saw the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot kind of starting to reflect on where is God in that mixture. And we saw Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. We had some good conversation about our way of understanding that Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, where we saw the father leaves the son to go to the marketplace. The father comes back and finds that his son was learning Torah. So was that we had a good conversation about like what is God in that metaphor? Is God or parable? Is God abandoning us, or is God's busy and God has to do stuff, and good for the kid who's learning Torah. But what does it mean then that the kid was learning Torah without, or that we are learning Torah then without God present in that solitary learning? So we saw that as kind of one model, that maybe learning in solitude is problematic, versus then we saw Rav Anan, who was learning in solitude in order to kind of cut back into that purity model of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who notably didn't learn alone. He learned with his son, his chavruta. But Elijah then can come to Rav Anan because he has achieved that level of purity. But at the same time, learning alone means that Rav Anan can't, first of all, is almost like a punishment for him. And second of all, means he can't continue his work of judging, of being a dayan. So there is almost like a back to that punitive question about Tzaraat that got tied back in with Rav Anan. So today we're going to be taking a very different track. And we're going to be looking at Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. So we have, if the Talmud is maybe around the year 500-ish of the Common Era, Rebbe Nachman of Breslov was born in 1772. So we've really jumped, 1,200 years. We've through Jewish history. That we did, of course, see Maimonides last time. We've seen some other kind of people in between. We haven't completely skipped all the medievals, but we a little bit skipped the Middle Ages here. Rebbe Nachman of Breslov was I imagine most of the people here and listening are familiar with Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. He lived. He traveled around a little bit. He's known for Breslov, but actually is buried in Uman. That's what's confusing. He's like, oh, the Breslovers, they go to Uman. People don't think about how confusing that is, but those are different places. And so when they were in Breslov, they kind of decided, oh, the name of this town is going to live on forever. We're going to be Breslov Hasidim, but then they ended up moving to Uman, which is where Nachman is buried. Anyways, Nachman lived a short and sad life. He died at the age 38 of tuberculosis. He lost, I think, almost all of his children died. At least one of his wives died. He not a polygamist, in order wives, and just a very, very hard. He was also quite depressed and sad a lot of the time, and his writings about sadness are part of what, Breslov Hasidim, if you said, oh, the founder of Breslov Hasidim was very sad, first you'd be like, what do you mean? They're the people jumping around, blasting music from the rooftops, but maybe knowing that actually helps make sense of it, because then he was very focused on pursuit of happiness. And the people who focus on the pursuit of happiness are perhaps the people who are the least happy themselves. So it kind of fits together once you know all the pieces. But that's an interesting thing about Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. Hitbodedut was not a one-off, he one time said something interesting about that. Rebbe Nachman was perpetually talking about Hitbodedut. It's woven through all of his works. Sometimes people say that the most impactful rabbis are the people who have kind of very few messages that they just keep hammering every single time. A teacher, a very beloved teacher of Tanakh in Israel named Alex Israel wrote on Facebook recently that, Rav Lichtenstein was always talking about how you just need to learn Torah. Oh, this holiday's coming up. this holiday's about Torah. This holiday's coming up. This holiday's about Torah too. And that some of the most impactful rabbis, they kind of have like one main message, and then their students leave the yeshiva and they walk away with that one main message. So Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, Hitbodedut was really one of his main messages, and we're gonna look at how he writes it. So Hitbodedut is, we'll talk about exactly what it is, but it's an affirmative practice of solitude. And solitude and meditation and solitude, and there's other pieces that we'll only, meaning we're not going to look at the entire corpus of everything written by Rebbe Nachman today. So we're just going to be scratching the surface, but these are some parts that I think are helpful in terms of understanding what the project is, how it makes sense, and hopefully then we'll be able to a little bit put it into conversation with some of the other questions we've been raising about quarantine and about this time that we've all been living through, and whether there's a way to kind of make sense of it all together or not. As we've said, it's been a very confusing time, and I don't know that there's like a silver bullet of a text that's gonna kind of illuminate all of it for us. But I do hope that some of the diversity of these texts mean that we can say, like, we're not the first people in history who've ever done this, and we can at least find, if we can't find uplift, then at least we can find connection in learning some of these texts that might be reflective on this time that we've all been living through. But I think one of the things that for me feels exciting about Rebbe Nachman is the possibility of saying, we have potentially a couple more months of this. Is there another, at the beginning we were all kind of baking bread, then we were all like knitting or whatever, like maybe in these last couple of months our project can be, here is a person who thought, like, if you can't find a time to be by yourself, then like pretend that you're learning in yeshiva. And then I don't think I actually brought you this part. He has the part where he says, like, if you can't find a time to be alone, then like put a sefer open in front of you in yeshiva and like do Hitbodedut there, and no one will bother you because they'll think you're learning. So in some ways, Rebbe Nachman would have been maybe very jealous of our times because he was in this pursuit of solitude in a way that is going to, I think, feel like really strange and jarring for many of us, given what we've all been through and how ready many people are, though not everyone, is to kind of get back to a little bit more normalcy. So just a little bit of introduction to Rabbi Nachman's works. As I mentioned, he died very young. He died at the age of 38. He had a student named Reb Nosson of Nemerav, who was his like main student, but then also the author of and whatever, the person who made the books happen. So the first Likutei Maharan part 1 was written in Rebbe Nachman's lifetime. We're going to see some from part 1. Part 2 came out posthumously and is kind of more obviously written by Rav Nosson. We're going to also look at Sichos Haran, which was also their recordings of teachings of Rabbi Nachman by Rav Nosson. So he kind of has like a like a mouthpiece for his writing, and Rav Nosson was it. But that's how, meaning not he was so. Also, I should mention a little bit about who he was in addition to that. He was the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. He amassed followers in his lifetime, but because of Rav Nosson, the people say, like, was his first chassid, was like his first follower. And so they were kind of always like a team together. And Rav Nosson is responsible for a lot of like what we know today of Breslov and for Rabbi Nachman's teachings really living on. All right, so with that introduction, I'm going to share my screen. And Michael has put the source sheet into the chat. Thank you. All right, so we're starting out in Likutei Maharan 1, and this is Torah 52. That's what these numbers are. It's like Torah 52, part 1. Okay, so he's going to quote a Mishnah. Rabbi Chanina ben Chakinai Omer, Hanei ora balayla v'hamehalich b'derech yechidi u'mefaneli bo levatala. Someone who's awake at night and who goes his way alone and makes room in his heart for empty thoughts, he is liable for his own soul. So that makes it think liable. Mitchayev b'nafsho does not seem like a good thing. Mitchayev b'nafsho makes it seem like you like if you're reading Rabbi Chanina ben Chakinai's statement, you would think all of these things are bad. You should never walk a path alone. You should not be awake at night. and you should not make space in your, you should not be mifaneli v'olavatala. You should not make room in your heart for empty thoughts. All of those things are bad. Rabbi Nachman, you'll be unsurprised to hear, is going to flip this on his head. But through that teaching and through that flipping, hopefully what he'll do is kind of explain what the point of Hitbodedut is in a way that I think is surprising, maybe. I think for us, like, meditation is just so part of the, like, culture that we sort of just are like, okay, Hitbodedut, meditation, it's all the same. But Rabbi Nachman really has a quite clear agenda about, like, what Hitbodedut is for. And here I think is where he lays that out pretty well. So he says, there are heretics who say that the world is a necessary reality. We'll get to what that means in a second. And according to their evil, wrong, erroneous opinions, and they're based on that opinion, it seems to them that they have proofs and examples from the way the world functions. Okay, well, let's finish the paragraph and then we'll talk about what this might mean. But all that is nonsense, because the truth is that the world and all it contains are a contingent reality. So what are they contingent on? He's going to explain in a second that they are contingent on God, meaning the world does not necessarily exist. You can't learn anything out from the fact that the world exists. That actually doesn't teach you anything. The world only exists because God said to exist. And if heretics are people who say, oh, we know the world must necessarily exist, and therefore we can learn kind of other logical things from the fact that the world, like, necessarily exists. And he would say, no, that's all nonsense, and that can't be the foundation for anything, because that statement is wrong. The world is contingent. What is the world contingent on? Only the Holy One necessarily exists. But every planet and everything that is on it, that is all contingent. Because God created them something out of nothing. And God's capability was to create the world or to not create the world. And therefore the world and all it contains are contingent realities. They're contingent on God's decision to have them exist. The only thing that is necessary, the only thing that certainly exists, you cannot imagine anything without this, is God. Okay, but he's curious about the mistake. Where do they get this crazy idea that the world is a necessary reality? No, it stems from the fact that now the souls of Israel have already been brought down into believing that the world is a necessary reality. And the whole world was created only for Israel, as is known. And Jews, this is obviously complicated, asterisk, okay, fine. And Jews are the rulers of the world. So what happened? God created the souls of Israel, and then that kind of obligated God in creating a world for those souls then to live on, because those souls were so important that kind of like forced God's hand almost into creating the world. So, and that means that it kind of like, or that makes it seem like the world is a necessary reality, but actually only God is a necessary reality. God chose to create the souls of Israel, but if the souls of Israel are going to exist, they have to exist in the world, and that makes the world appear as if it's a necessary reality, and that's how people make mistakes. Okay, I know you're like, what does this have to do with anything? But just hang with us, okay? אך נשמעו ישראל בעצמן כשנעצלו היו הם בעצמן עם כל העולמות התלויים בהם וכל היה אפשרי המציאות כי היה באפשרותו להצילם ולברעם או שלא לברעם. But remember, God did not have to create the souls of Israel, and that makes everything contingent. But when God wanted to put forth the souls of Israel, that made all, he's a little bit repetitive here, that meant that the whole world needed to be created. And so like once the souls of Israel existed, then the world became then the world became like necessary, not contingent. He's just repeating himself. Fine. Right? So, but this is how the heretics got to their mistakes, because it seems like everything that really God could have not created any of this, and God could have not created the Jews, and then wouldn't have needed to create the world. But it makes it seem like there are pieces of the world which are necessary because of this whole puzzle. Okay. The reason why God created Israel is so that Israel would do God's will. And they would go back and they would attach to their own roots, which is God, which is, right, what are their roots? The roots are God. God is the only necessary reality. God is the creator of all. רק בשביל זה מחויב השם יתברך כביכול לברוא לקיים כל העולמות בשביל ישראל כנ"ל כדי שיציר רצונו כנ"ל. So therefore, what comes out of this is that when Jews do God's commandment and God's will, they become like deeply enveloped in their source, which is God, who is the only non-contingent thing that exists, and therefore they become like connected and an extension of things that are non-contingent. And they become connected to their tachlit, to their purpose, which is what the world was even created for, because the whole world was created because Israel had been created, and Israel was created so that they would do the will of God. So you have God needing someone to do their will, which then makes God create Israel, which then makes God create the whole world, which then leads some people to mistakenly think that the world is not contingent, that the world is necessary. But actually, the only thing that's necessary is God, and everything else is just an outcome there. Okay. But when the Jewish people do God's will, then the world actually gets encompassed by this element of necessary reality. So when Jews do mitzvot, or they cleave to God, everything about the world starts to make sense and be kind of fulfilling. So all of a sudden, a lot depends on Jews doing God's will, because God is the only necessary reality. Everything else is contingent on that. And the reason why all of these contingent things were created were so that the Jewish people could do God's will, which means that when the Jewish people do God's will, everything starts to feel more and more connected, closer to God's will, encompassed in that necessary reality, because it all kind of fits more tightly in to like the necessity that is God. Okay, so we're starting out real big here, but we're gonna get there. Okay. אך לזכות לזה להיכלל בשורשו, דהיינו לחזור להיכלל באחדות השם יתברך, שהוא מחויב המציאות, זה אי אפשר לזכות כי אם על ידי ביטול, שיבטל עצמו לגמרי עד שיהיה נכלל באחדותו יתברך. Here's where we're starting to get to the point, which is that the point is to be this like encompassed in the necessariness of God, in the oneness of God. And how do you get there? That is through bitul, that is through negation, transparency. Once you make yourself transparent, you can cleave completely, you can become encompassed in the oneness of God by self-nullification, by this process of bitul. Here we get there. So the only way to attain this bitul, which again, bitul is not I'm a nothing. It's not really like a navarda kind of musar. It's bitul is actually about connection. It's about roots. It's about your shoresh in God and about your mission, which is doing God's will. And the more you focus on that mission, the more you're part of just the giant, like overarching oneness of God, which is in a certain sense self-abnegation. But again, like it's not in like a deprivation kind of self-abnegation. It's like making yourself part of something bigger, which is actually like adds to your own grandeur in a certain way. It's so to say like this, right? So I just want to like push back on the way we normally think about these words of like self-nullification or self-abnegation. Like it's not about making yourself small. It's about making yourself part of something much bigger than yourself. And in that sense, making yourself big. Okay. So how do you get there? You get there through Hitbodedut. You get there through this process of solitude. Because by being alone, and through speaking at length between yourself and God, that's how you nullify all of your desires, all of the bad aspects of your personality, until you've really negated all of your corporeality, and that's how you then connect to your roots. Okay, so that was all just by way. We've come really a long way. Right? We have like a whole cosmology in order to get to Hitbodedut. So that just tells you something about how important Hitbodedut is. You can think of other Jewish texts that give a cosmology in order to get like an understanding of the whole universe in order to get to like one point. The one that comes to mind for me is the piyut about the avoda on Yom Kippur that starts out with Genesis and talks about the creation of everything from nothing and why was all of that worth it so that there could be atonement, right? That's the avoda of Yom Kippur makes that argument, and here Rebbe Nachman is making that argument for Hitbodedut, because the point of Hitbodedut is to become just like this closeness and connectedness to God, which is why the Jewish people were created, which is then why everything else that exists was created, so that we could be close to the one non-contingent thing that exists, which is God. But God is the one necessary thing. Okay, so just to kind of lay out like how important this is to Rebbe Nachman when you think about the way this literature was just composed in comparison to like other things that kind of exist within our library. Okay. Now he's going to turn a little bit more practical. That was maybe the like what Hitbodedut, and now is the how Hitbodedut, let's say. Okay. Achikar Hitbodedut hu balayla. So again, we're still talking about that Mishnah we started out with, right? That was like one who is awake at night or who walks in solitude, or who thinks, or who is mevatel, right? That language, who thinks about bitul type things. So now we're starting to kind of see how this is all going to be flipped towards the positive. That is that person is mitchayev b'nafsho. That was the original language of the Mishnah. Okay. So here he goes. So achikar Hitbodedut hu balayla. The main time for for this practice of solitude is at night. When people are free of the preoccupations of our world. Because during the day, everyone's pursuing things that are this worldly. And while you're pursuing the stuff of this world, you get confused, and it's hard to spend that time really sticking to and becoming encompassed by God. But feeling mubatzmo inu tarut, and maybe you personally, you're actually doing okay. You're not so distracted by it. But because the world is distracted by it, during the day, the world is distracted, and they're in this state of pursuit. They're pursuing all of the vanities of this world. You might be so calm and so relaxed, but everyone around you is running around pursuing things of this world. And let's be real, that's going to have an effect on you, says Rebbe Nachman. And that's why at night is the better time, when nobody, like even the people around you, they're actually not pursuing those things at night either. Obviously, we all know work plenty at night, but imagine a time before electricity. Okay. So Hitbodedut should also take place in a special place. What is that special place? Away from the city, on a secluded road, in a place that's not frequented by people. So the places where people go during the day and where they're pursuing this world, even though right now they're not in those places, a place that's even like built for such pursuits, that too can really confuse your practice of Hitbodedut. And you're not able to attain this bitul and be encompassed by God in a place like that. Al-kain tzarich she'elech levado b'layla b'derech yechivi b'makom she'en sham adam v'sham yilech v'yitboded. You have to go by yourself at night, alone, to a place where there's no other people, and that's where you'll go, and you'll sit in solitude, and you'll open up you'll empty, right? That's better than opening up. You'll empty your heart and your mind from all of their worldly things. And you'll nullify everything until you really achieve this aspect of bitul. So again, the point of Hitbodedut, or the aim of Hitbodedut, is to achieve bitul, at which point you have made space then to be encompassed by God. So bitul and encompassing by, like, negation of self and encompassing by God are the same thing. It's like when you exhale, you've now made space for the inhale, like all in this kind of one motion. That when you push out something else, you've opened up this space that then can be filled anew. And what does it automatically get filled by? It automatically kind of, once you've done this work of bitul, it'll sort of like necessarily, almost like mechanically get filled in by God if you've really done the work of bitul. Okay, so how do you do it? I knew. So at the beginning, when you do this, when you go to your secluded place alone at night, you'll be really chatty, you'll pray, you'll talk a lot, until you can kind of move past that and nullify that instinct. Right? When you can move past that desire to speak in that way. And then you'll do even more of this Hitbodedut, of this exact kind, alone at night, all that, until you move past another desire that you have. And just one by one, you'll do Hitbodedut for a really long time. And one by one, all of your desires, things you want to do, ways that you feel awkward about yourself maybe, all of those will become nullified. and then there'll still be one other thing, and you'll nullify that too, until there is nothing left. Pirush ki achuli od achar shebitel kol hatavot v'midor od adai nishar mimenu klum. Dai mishadai lo bitel lagamre hageut v'hagasut ad shenechshav beinav leizu davar. But the thing is, you could actually negate all your physical desires, and you'll have nothing left in, but you'll be filled up with your nothing, which means you'll be so proud of yourself for having done your bitul. You'll say, "Oh, I'm full of nothing. Look at me and all my nothing," and that too is bad. Al kain tzrichim להתייגע להרבות והתבודדות הנ"ל עד שלא נשאר ממנו כלום, שיהיה בבחינת מה באמת עד שיזכה לבחינת ביטול באמת. So if you feel really proud of yourself that you've achieved nothing, then you haven't truly achieved nothing. You have to get to the level of ma, of what, almost. That's like a hard to translate in this context. And then you'll truly have merited bitul. So when you achieve this true bitul, and your soul will be wrapped up in its origins, which is obviously God, because He is the only necessary part of existence. שהוא מחויב המציאות, כי הכל תלוי בו, כנ"ל, ואזי נעשה כל העולם על ידו בבחינת מחויב המציאות. So you'll be totally connected to God, you'll realize and understand deeply that everything's connected to God, that everything that exists in the world was made by God. ואתה תראה, פלאות, איך כל זה מבואר מהמשנה הנ"ל בארי טוב. And now we're going to understand how it all fits in so nicely to the Mishnah, which we started out with. So here we go. Haneor balayla, someone who's awake at night, kifshuto, this is as the words say. Dahainu shu haneor balayla, umitboded, umefarish sechato beino levinkro. You're awake at night, and you're alone, and you're just speaking to God. Which, by the way, I should have said this before, but even that is something that we don't normally do. And the ability to just kind of open up, talk to God. For Rebbe Nachman, I think we'll see this inside at some point today. But for Rebbe Nachman, this idea that you'll just talk to God, that's like a really, like the goal is to just talk to God like a friend. Like God is your friend, you talk to God, you like experience in a certain way, God talking back, that's the dream. Okay. So and then when the Mishnah says, he says, yeah, that's also like what we had said. Right, a place you'll be alone, there won't be other people walking there. And that's really like the heart of the Hitbodedut. Okay, good. That's how you achieve bitul. Mefaneli bola vatala, right? We started out saying mefaneli bola vatala. That sounds really bad. It sounds like you've turned your heart to negative things or to silly things or something like that. And he says, no, mefaneli bola vatala is you have made room in your heart for a nullification. The hainush mefaneli bola mikoli skeholam. You've cleaned out space in your heart from all of the things of this world. Because you're striving for this element of nullification. And then your soul will merit to be tied up in the God who is the mechuyav hamitziyut, the necessary reality. And actually you'll bring along all the worlds through your work of bitul, and from opening up space and leaving that space for God to come in, and making that space more and more. That's when you will have cleaved to God, and you'll be closer to that necessary existence, and you'll have brought everything in that necessary existence with you. Okay, so now what is this hariza mechayiv b'nafsho, right? Because that sounded really bad, mechayiv b'nafsho. So how do you understand that? Shenichlal kol ha'olam mibchinat mechuyav hamitziyut im nafsho. The entire world is encompassed together in this aspect of necessary reality with your soul. כי על ידי ההתבודדות זכה לבחינת הביטול עד שנכלל נפשו בחיוב המציאות, right? מתחייב בנפשו חיוב המציאות. So through your Hitbodedut, you achieved nullification, which then meant that your soul could be wrapped up with the chiyuv hametziut, with the necessary reality, which is God. And you brought the whole world with you. And then you made so much space for God, that you've connected with God, that you've achieved, you've partaken in this necessary reality that is God and now is you, as God has expanded through your bitul into closer and closer connection to you. And that is the mitchayev b'nafsho. That is the mitchayev with his own reality. Okay. So here he's just gonna explain. I just want to round this out. He's gonna explain. He's just gonna say a little bit more about this. V'dashi kar bitul shadam mevatel yeshuto v'ne'sa ayin. A person negates his corporeality. He becomes connected to nothingness. Michlal ba'achtuto Hashem yitbarach, and becomes, through that process, becomes connected to God. And the only way to do that, the only way to do that is through Hitbodedut. And just to recap some of the things that we've said, the only way to do that is by having a specific time and a specific place, and where other monim, other sources of movement are not going to be bothering him, and other things that are kind of almost like the opposite of this project, which are people going about their daily business and people being filled up with achieving their desires in this world, and things like that. Those won't be around. You have to create the right environment for that. And when you have succeeded in that, and you become you become surrounded by the oneness of God, but you become essentially part of the oneness of God, and that is when you have left Azai. Here, just finishing this last sentence here. Azai, that's when you, who started out contingent, are now nichlal v'mechuyav. You've made yourself necessary. That, right? So now it all connects from where we started to where we are. You started out. It's very important. You have to know that you're contingent, that God created you. You don't necessarily exist. The world doesn't necessarily exist. All of that is heresy. But you, through the tools of Hitbodedut, can make yourself necessary through Hitbodedut by becoming nichlal b'mechuyav, by eliminating all of this kind of gashmias and taiva, right? All of the materiality of this world and all the desires of this world, can make space for God, cleave to God, become part of God almost, and that will make you no longer contingent, but included in the necessity. You'll be included in God. And that's how you are chayev b'nafsho, that you've made your soul part of God. You've made your soul part of the chiyuv. You've made your soul part of the necessary. That is chayev b'nafsho, is you have turned your soul from contingent to necessary. That's the harei zeh chayev b'nafsho. So first of all, it's just this most amazing, astounding read of the Mishnah. I'm going to pause for a second. I saw there was some activity in the chat. Okay, we have a joke from Navar. Oh, look who thinks he's nothing. Yes, exactly. Okay, great. Hi, are you saying something? You are on mute. Are you talking to me? I want you to be talking to me. Should I ask you?
Hi. Sorry, I was just saying, I thought I was unmuted. I was just saying that I didn't see, I was typing it and then I pressed enter and then I realized someone had already written it. So sorry about that.
Yeah. No, why? Don't be sorry. That's awesome. Yeah, we were all thinking the same thing. Exactly. Look who thinks he's a garnish. So definitely, Rebbe Nachman address that kind of head on here. Exactly. Okay, so I think and we're gonna see some other texts about Hitbodedut, but we just spent the majority of our time on this one. But I think with good reason, because really what he's doing here is explaining not just the kind of how to, which obviously is interesting, but really the why and what is the purpose of this. And the purpose of it is almost to like the end goal is to make ourselves, but through ourselves, everything that was created for ourselves, i.e. all of the world and other people and all of that, to make everything no longer contingent, but necessary. Right now, the only thing that is necessary is God, but the more space we can open up within ourselves for God, the more necessary we can make ourselves, which obviously is really important if we think existence is good. Yohannes, please.
It kind of reminds me the midrash that said that the whole world was contingent until Matan Torah, until Shavuos, Yom HaShishi, that 6th day of Sivan, because otherwise the world would have no purpose without Torah.
Totally. Yeah. Yes, definitely. You know, that's a continuation of the Gemara in Shabbat. That's the famous Kaf Alem Har Kagigi that God held over the mountain, like I don't know, whatever, like a roof, and threaten them, like, if you don't accept the Torah, I'll destroy you here. And then I think it's Rish Lakish there who says, yeah, that's the hey in Hashishi is the contingency built into creation, that if you don't accept the Torah, then this is it. Then the 6th day will be your end. Exactly what Yohannes is saying. Deborah, I saw you had a hand before.
Yeah, so he of course is turning the pshat of the Mishnah on its head completely. But also, and at the same time, he's saying he's turning around or completely reinterpreting the view of the Apikorsim that that the creation is this, the world is necessary, and of course the world is contingent on God. So the Apikorsim don't have God in that whole, in that their whole equation, but he inserts God at the center of things as the source of everything. And then through this mystical practice, gets to this sort of the same place, not the same place really, but gets to sort of like, this is the goal, is to make it that way. Not,
I love that.
And the Apikorsim are misled by that to conclude that there's no God. But we, by centering God, centering everything on God, and trying to come as close as possible to, cleave unto God, although it doesn't use that language, but in our attempt to cleave to God, to experience God in this mystical way through Hitbodedut and Bitul, that's we arrive at sort of that same place, but completely different way. One is without and one is with God. It's the same world.
And I think the other flip that he does is the flip of this language of bitul, right? So in the Mishnah, being like, and we, I mean, all over
it's bittul Torah. It's a waste. Yeah.
Right, exactly, waste. And he says, no, exactly, that nullification is good, it's important, it's godly, emptying ourselves. Like normally we would say, right, we talk about all other times we talk about emptiness. You can think of like a chilul Hashem or something like that, right? And he's saying, like, you can imagine him saying, yes, like chilul Hashem, you make the chilul and then Hashem comes in. Like that's almost like what's happening here, which is so different from the way we use this language other times, and certainly the way I meant it in the Mishnah. But it is this kind of amazing flip, and one of the reasons why I love these flips is that, like, one of the challenges that I'm raising up as an opportunity is to say, how can we take an experience that for so many of us for the last many months has been very, very hard, in a way that and offer a flip to it, almost offer a way to say, if we choose to, we can take even the most like negative words that we associate with it and even imbue those with spiritual purpose and meaning, or even to take the experiences that we've had of loneliness, of solitude, and say, well, okay, what if, like with the the end in sight, I'm going to try and really like dive into it as a potential really good. Like that's what, and I think he's really, until now, every single time that we've seen aloneness, we've seen there be like a real, like a loss to it or a danger to it. We saw the person who studies Torah by himself, he becomes an idiot, he's sinning. The leper obviously is a clear example of it, but even with the Kohanim, it's like what they're doing is dangerous and all of that. Like there's some real kind of like negatives to it in a certain sense. Even like Elijah or Shimon Bar Yochai, like it's not this unambiguous good. And for Rebbe Nachman, it actually really is an unambiguous good. It's like, yeah, there's really nothing better than this. I see a chat. Okay, someone watching on Facebook. If the world can be transformed into the necessary, then the world, in a sense, can become God. This sounds like Kabbalah, which claims you can join with the Godhead and become one with God. Yes, totally. That is, yes, Mr. Orbach. Or I don't actually, not going to assume your gender. Yes, definitely. And obviously, Rabbi Nachman and the whole Hasidic tradition are deeply influenced by Kabbalah. What we see is that Rabbi Nachman writes in this like very accessible or like seemingly accessible language. Like you don't see so many words here that you've never like seen before, but they kind of take on like new meaning. So he doesn't use some of this like super technical, complicated Kabbalistic language that we see in other places, even within the like Hasidic corpus. But it is certainly kind of lying behind it. Okay, let me just think because we have only 8 minutes here. And I do want to kind of wrap up at the end. Okay, so here he's talking about how to kind of, right? So at the beginning, he said this in the last one, at the beginning, when you're talking to God, you're just gonna like discourse. You're just gonna go at night to your quiet place by yourself where people aren't busy around you, and you're gonna just talk. So here he's saying, how do you talk? You should talk in the vernacular. So he says talk in, they translate it here in one's native tongue, but that, it's Vilshon Ashkenaz, right? It's in your native tongue, which is German, or whatever, was his native tongue, but Ukrainian, Polish, Yiddish, whatever it is. But right, that also this practice of just talking to God, again, as I mentioned, like the way that you would talk to a friend, because that's the idea. And what's also the other purpose of it, by the way, is you should do Hitbodedut frequently and like really with a lot of regularity as often as possible. And midei yom b'yom sha'a miyuchedet, you should have a set time for it every single day. Ushar hayom yeh b'simcha, and that will mean that the rest of the day you can be happy. That actually, like setting this time aside, will open up like paths to happiness the rest of the day. And then he says, well, what if you can't think of anything to say? Okay, all very practical. Everyone can do it. You should do this. Old people should do this. Young people should do this. People of big souls and people of small souls. And he says, so, and this is Sichot Oran, we talked about that. So far we've talked also about like, you should do it at these very specific times. But here he's saying you should do it in specific places. So if you can't, in the continuation of this is where, I didn't bring it for you, but this is where he says, if you can't find a good place for it, open up a seafair and no one will bother you. That's here. He says, ideally you should have a separate room, or as we saw before, like your own kind of place that you go to at night. Okay. And this we came around 2 here is where he talks about how if you can do it all day long, that's what you should do, right? And he ties it into Lavai Shipalel Adam Kol Yom Kulo. So we might say, okay, Rabbi Nachman imagines Hitbodedut for 1 hour a day when and the rest of the day I'm social and I'm with people and I'm doing stuff. Like, fine, that makes a lot of sense. But what, like, we've been all over for months and months and months. How can we possibly imagine a positive of that? And really, though, Rabbi Nachman says, "Sheretzono sheyanu kol hayom kulo hitbodedut ulevalo kol hayom al zeh." So he says the best would be if we could do this all day, if we could just spend all day by ourselves, trying to really strip ourselves down through this process of bitul, via conversation with God. The best thing would be if we could do this all day long, but most people can't actually do this, and therefore they have to have therefore you have to have sha'ah hitbodedut gam zeh tov me'od. That's good too, but really what you wish is all the time. And if you want to actually achieve that state that we put forward, that full cleaving to God, dvikus, that we discussed in that first section, if you really want to achieve that, right, that, okay, doing it 1 hour a day, that's tov me'od. But if you want to really, in truth, achieve it, sheyelo kol hayom hitbodedut. You need all day to be hitbodedut. That's really the dream. And how much, meaning how far should you go? You're looking for, he says, you're looking for here, this is again part 2, you're looking for shlimut. That the ad shia samuch ma'od shetitzei mishmato chas v'shalom, ad shekima yigva chas v'shalom, ad shel tehad mishmato kshura begufo ki im kechut hasa'ara me'otem ta'aro v'ga'agu'o chisufo l'Hashem yitbarach. Your desire to cleave to God should help you transcend your body so much that you've left your body behind, that you're basically that your soul is almost out of your body, as if you're chas v'shalom, not alive anymore. I don't think he means God forbid damage yourself or kill yourself or chas v'shalom, anything like that. The thing he's saying is that experience should be a soul out of body experience, and a soul out of body experience, what's another word for a soul out of body experience? Another word for that is death. So I think that's the language he has to use for it. But that's not actually, what he's pushing for. But again, he quotes from Tanya, right? Into the Tosha Adam Nishmat Ela Inkain Nisim Nafsho Bekapo. You have to be ready to kind of put your life in your hands if you want your truest tefillah, which is your hitbodedut, to be heard. And here, this is what I've been telling you about, but here we'll see it inside. And when God helps a person with their hitbodedut, azai hitbodedut hu kasher yidaber ish al re'ehu. Then the hitbodedut is like a conversation between friends. And I think what Rebbe Nachman means by this is not just the level of conversation, but also the level of hardship involved in it. So with the same pleasure that you talk to your friend, right at the beginning of this little Torah, he was saying, it's as if you're gonna die. That sounds really hard. And he's saying, no, it's not. Once you achieved it, once God helps you with it, then it's you're talking to friends, both at the level of that's how you talk to God and that's the relationship you have with God, but also that the pain is less there because you've kind of got, the pain was in this yearning, but when the yearning then is fulfilled, that's obviously okay. We're gonna stop here. You're very welcome to peruse the rest of this. I brought a lot here that we didn't get a chance all to look at together. But I do just want to thank you for kind of coming on this quarantine themed journey with me. I certainly have felt like these texts have helped me to kind of articulate different experiences that I've had or that I've seen other people have over the course of this past year. And I do think that sometimes seeing our pain and hardship reflected in our ancient traditional texts, there's something very healing about that potentially, to say we're not new, this isn't new, we're not alone. We can, we can feel connected even in the kind of loneliness and solitude of this. And then so that was kind of the last 3 weeks. And then this week was sort of and there's even a great potential, really this transcendent potential almost in solitude. And if we can find it within ourselves to do the level of work that he recommends, then maybe there's a way to really take advantage of this last little piece of this time and use the opportunity where we're not still maybe all going to shul and we're still maybe more at home to actually say, yes, there's a different kind of conversation that can be had with God in this less busy world of ours, and maybe an option to lean into it going forward. So thank you again so much for coming. I'm happy to stick around, but I want to bless you all with a beautiful Shavuos and beautiful rest of your Omer, and you know, for however much longer this lasts. I hope that there's connectedness and meaning and Torah that has spoken to you in some way.